We're here to talk about abattoirs. I'm joined by Bob Kennard, Phil Stocker, Paddy Hoare and Simon Cutter. We've all been working on a problem which is facing producer retailers in this country, which is that small abattoirs are disappearing, and they've been happening for a very long time, but we're getting to something close to a crisis point now. Now, we've changed the title of this session to A Good Life and a Good Death, and some people wondered whether a death can ever be good, but we'd argue that slaughter is an essential and integral part of livestock farming, and that many of us strive to give our animals a happy and a meaningful life while they're alive, but we lose control of that process when we have to send them miles away in a lorry to an abattoir, particularly a large abattoir where we get very impersonal treatment. The problem we've all faced is that over the last, certainly since about 1990, we've seen the rise of what we might call mega slaughterhouses in this country. One in particular, which is in South Wales. It's the largest in the country, but it's not by any means atypical. There are many more similar sized abattoirs. They've been built with large grant aid. That's an aerial view of it in the top left-hand corner. It's a St Mirren plant at Merthyr Tydfil, which was bought by two sisters recently from Vion, the Dutch company. Two Sisters is a Birmingham-based company. It's now Britain's largest meat wholesaler, retailer, slaughterer. It owns 35 factories, meat factories across in the UK, and another 6 or 8 across Europe. When that was built, it was the largest covered area in one place in the whole of Europe. And the supermarket, this has coincided with the rise of supermarkets and the decline of local butchers. And this abattoir in South Wales is largely buying for Tesco, and they buy livestock from the whole of the UK. So they're trucking sheep and cattle down from Scotland and other parts of England, as well as the rest of Wales, in lorries like the ones you can see there, which can take 4 decks of sheep. Now, for large farmers and for farmers who are farming intensively, you can say that system works very well because the cost of transport is relatively small when they're transporting like that, and they can get their animals slaughtered in those very large abattoirs more cheaply than they can in a small abattoir, because they've got economies of scale and very modern systems where the animals go past on a chain and each operative just does one cut as the animal comes past. It's not very good for the workers. They're not skilled workers. 75% of the workers now working in these sort of meat plants are from non-UK workers. And that contrasts with the pictures on the right-hand side, where you've got a small local abattoir. In fact, it's my own local abattoir in South Gloucestershire. I say local, it's now 40 miles away. Since we set up our farm shop in 1984, we've had to change abattoirs 8 times, as 7 of those abattoirs have closed down, and each time we've had to go further. So it is still just barely profitable for us to do it, but when we only want to take 1 bullock or 2 lambs 1 week, it's an 80-mile round trip to take the animals to the abattoir, and it's an 80-mile round trip to have the meat delivered back. So it's a 160-mile journey just to get a few lamb carcasses back, or whatever it is. For producers who are taking a couple of pigs like that, which contrasts very dramatically with the large-scale movement of pigs in lorries of that sort. For example, most of the pigs in this country are produced in the east of England, and there are no pig abattoirs in that part of the country. They all have to be trucked across to abattoirs elsewhere. We have to really ask, is this morally acceptable that we're in a situation where we're transporting animals? Legally, if it's no more than an 8-hour journey, then meat buyers are allowed to move animals for 8 hours. And that means virtually the whole of the UK is possible. And I think we'd argue that it's not morally acceptable, and that something needs to be done about it. It's also not environmentally acceptable, because we're creating all this extra pollution of the atmosphere with nitrous oxide from the diesel fumes and the fossil fuel putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and there are clearly animal welfare consequences to moving animals that far. Now, there are some parts of the country that are not particularly affected at the moment. For example, Devon has still got 6 relatively small abattoirs. Other parts of the country, like where I'm in Gloucestershire, there's now just the only abattoirs that are left are in the south of the county, so that for those of us in North Gloucestershire, it's a 40-mile trip to the nearest abattoir. If that were to close, we'd basically go out of business because it would just be too far to another abattoir, particularly one that was certified organic. And it's a problem which is already facing some producers. We've got examples in our group of producers having to take their animals 65 miles now to an abattoir, and there's one in Scotland that has had to give up to 130 miles to the nearest abattoir that would kill and let him have the animals back, what's called private kill. He could take them 32 miles, which he has to an abattoir and sell them to Tesco. But in order to get them back for his own farm shop, it's a 130-mile round trip, because not all the large abattoirs will do private kill. And some producer retailers also complain that when they go to these very large abattoirs, they can't get their own offal back. So you don't get your own liver, kidneys and so on back, simply because the abattoirs are not designed to do that. It's all done on such a mass scale that as soon as the offal has been passed fit by the meat inspector, it goes down a chute, and if it's been passed fit, they don't distinguish it. So if you're organic or pasture fed, you're still going to get anybody's liver or kidneys back, and if you're selling your meat at a premium, that's a huge problem. Right, now, Phil Stocker is Chief Executive of the National Sheep Association, and he is going to tell you about the NSA and the work, why this is significant to them.
So, as Richard said, my name is Phil Stocker. I'm the Chief Executive of the National Sheep Association. I joined the organisation just over 6 years ago, after having spent nearly 16 years working for the Soil Association, actually. So I feel very comfortable here, not just in the seat, but in this company as well. What I'm going to try and do here is to give an industry-wide, a bigger industry-wide perspective of why small-scale abattoirs are important. The first thing is just in terms of the industry, lots of people tell me that the future for efficiency and sustainability of the sheep industry is to very much follow the New Zealand model. And we're a very different place to New Zealand. We're a small country with a very big population. We've got 60% of our market here on our doorstep. 60% of our production goes into our domestic market. Around about 40% is exported. We're a very, very different place. Our production here in the UK is highly land and meat market focused. We're not largely a sheep dairy country. And we've got a high dependence on grass and free range and a high involvement with agri-environment schemes. So it all points to me that we're a very desirable industry, and everything that Michael Gove has been saying over recent times suggests to me that the sheep industry has got a strong part to play in agriculture, and probably an increasingly strong part to play in agriculture in the future. The industry is very much made up of two different structures, if you like, and people will be aware of the stratified nature of the sheep industry. Anyone who's been to agricultural college for the last 30 or 40 years would have been told about the stratified industry, where we have hardy, high maternal genetics in the uplands, and we produce half-bred breeding stock, and they come onto the lowlands in the form of crossbreds or mules and half-bred sheep, and largely those lowland sheep then produce finished lambs for the meat market. Now, there's a lot of the borders, the boundaries between those systems are not black and white. They're not necessarily clear. But the little chart on the right-hand side, the box on the right-hand side, is an important one. If you look back in 1971, 86% of our total sheep numbers were involved in some way in that stratified system, with 14% being closed flocks in the lowlands. And at the time, a lot of those closed flocks in the lowlands would have been purebred pedigree sheep that would have been producing pedigree females and males for sale as well. And if you fast forward then to 2012, those numbers have changed. 56% of our total sheep numbers are involved in that stratified system, the upland to lowland relationship, and 44% are now closed flocks in the lowlands. So there's been a massive shift that has really affected the genetics of the UK sheep flock. The little graph on the left-hand side shows consumption levels of lamb, sheep meat, beef and chicken, and you can see where the consumption of lamb has gone since 1950 through to beyond 2010, and there's been a gradual ongoing decline since 2010 as well. Whereas if you look at chicken, that yellow line, it's gone upwards, and again we all know the reason for that really. So consumption of lamb is down, even though I would argue strongly it's probably one of the most sustainable meats that we can get. So consumption is down, but if you look at the consumption in that age group of under 30s and 30 to 49, that's where the two blue arrows are, the consumption in that age range is alarmingly low, and no one can convince me that when that age range suddenly get to 50, they're going to wake up in the morning and suddenly decide it's a good idea to eat lamb. If they don't eat lamb in that age range, it's very unlikely that they're going to start at any stage in the future. There's been a lot of work going on over the last decade or more, I guess, around product development, quicker ways to cook sheep meat. Should we make sheep meat more like beef, chicken, processed, available in McDonald's, Lord knows what. But there's been lots of attempts at trying to make sheep meat more attractive to the market generally and to young people. But what I would say is that diversity in the sheep industry is crucially important. We're probably, of all the farming sectors, we're probably the one that has held on to our traditional methods and systems much more than anyone else. The NSA has got 83 registered sheep breeds that are affiliated with us. 83. Now there's somewhere in the region of just over 60 purebred sheep breeds here in the UK, but when you include all the half-breds and the mule associations and 83, so that suggests to me that there's a huge amount of diversity out there on the ground. And that diversity is undoubtedly connected with people's personal interests in terms of what they want to do, what they feel, and a lot of people keep sheep because they're interested in sheep, not necessarily because they're good at functioning. But it's also that diversity also comes from the link with the landscape, and certainly sheep breeds and strains within breeds are more closely connected and suited to different land types, terrains, climates and the like. So on a farm that diversity is crucially important. In terms of the marketplace, I still think we're in the sheep industry in a very good place in that we've got quite a diverse marketplace. 60% of our product is sold here into the UK, into our domestic market, with around about 25% of that going into the halal market. 40% of that 60% volume would go into supermarkets, and around 35% into butchers, farm shops, the more local and direct supply chains. Around about 40% of our production would be exported. Most of that would go as carcasses and cuts, and 96% of that volume would go to the EU. So again, that tells you how important that ongoing trade agreement with the EU and ongoing access to the EU market without paying tariffs is going to be to our industry. I would argue very strongly that diversity is a strength. In genetics, I've said already, but it's a result of the suitability to the place and the individuality of the farmer. And in the market, it creates a lot of competition, keeps prices up, it reduces risks, and it caters for a very varied product. That varied product is coming from somewhere in the region of 83 different breed types and all their crosses as well. Over the last few years, farmers have rightly responded to market signals, and all elements of the market for the industry, I would argue, are important. But if those markets continue to be of growing scale, but decline in options, then it will result in a more homogeneous product, something that the industry has been encouraged to push toward for the last few decades. And it will result in a clash with the land-based nature of sheep farming. And that's one of the reasons why the NSA launched a feasibility study looking to see what we could do to create market demands for what we would call our heritage breeds and our heritage farming systems. There is a need to ensure that the marketplace supports what we can produce sustainably and naturally. Even though most farms will produce for an identified need, a healthy and diverse market needs to be underpinned by a diversity of adequate and appropriate slaughter facilities. And the small-scale abattoirs, the medium throughput abattoirs, and on-farm slaughtering, I would see as a crucial part of that.
Can you just explain a little bit more to everyone about why the Heritage Breeds project requires slaughtering facilities locally?
Yeah, I can. I mean, the reason we started to look at the heritage breeds approach was simply because I just see that if you look at the fragile areas of this country in particular, and there'd be a lot more that you could argue this would be appropriate for as well. But if you look at those most fragile areas, like the uplands of this country, they are undoubtedly reliant on a particular type of sheep. And those sheep, I'm talking there about the Herdwicks, the Swaledales, the Welsh Mountains, those sheep are essential for they're essential genetics for grazing in those sorts of climate. But they also struggle to fit the mainstream specifications that the supermarkets and the export markets are starting to require. And there's a real clash there. It means that either those farmers are put under pressure to change their genetics and they're forced to move to a breed of sheep that doesn't really fit their environment. And again, that results in them either having to put up buildings or start by feeding. It leads to unsustainability within that system. So you end up with mainstream market specifications requiring a certain product and a certain landscape naturally connected to a breed of sheep that don't fit it. And what we've said is that we need to make sure that the market supports the genetic diversity, particularly in those more fragile landscape areas. And if we're creating markets for those sorts of products, they're very closely connected to local markets, independent markets, whether it's direct to consumers or whether it's through catering markets. And if those sheep are being produced, they've always got a stamp of a local stamp, a heritage stamp around them. It's absolutely crucial that they're slaughtered in similar facilities to the production system.
Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, I'm Bob Kennard, and I've been involved with Richard on this work on the abattoirs, and it's a bit like the old days, isn't it? We originally did a report for the Soil Association in 1999 because we saw there was a crisis coming, and it's still coming. So we've got together again, haven't aged a bit, and we're hoping that we can galvanise some interest in this what we consider to be a very, very important issue. It's relocalising the slaughter of farm animals that we're talking about. The biggest question, of course, is what small abattoirs have ever done for us. And the answer, of course, is, well, not a lot, apart from the public good benefits that they've achieved. And they're quite a few and wide-ranging. And the whole point of this is that smaller local abattoirs are not just a building where animals go in at one end and meat comes out at the other, but they are a catalyst for all sorts of other developments in the rural community. So there's direct jobs, there's ancillary businesses, and there's particularly young people who might want to set up a mail order system from their farm to make a bit of extra cash and add value to their product. Then there's the environment, of course, and Richard's touched on this, the reduction in food miles from the transport, not having to run up and down the length of the country, is bound to be a positive thing. Consumers, you're giving them real choice. Just out of interest, I looked last week at Tesco online, not the thing that I do very often, I have to say. They have 56 items in their beef range, but actually there's only 23 different cuts. I then looked at 3 completely randomly chosen retailer producers who are also online. The first one offered 44 cuts, the second one 65 cuts, and this is all beef, and the third one, who's here this morning, Piper's Farm, 31. So it just shows you that there's a great fallacy about supermarkets offering choice. Actually, they diminish it. Animal welfare, a very important issue, and it's obviously it's an obvious point that it's very much reduced if you have local slaughtering facilities. And the economic development, for every £1 spent locally, £4 is developed within the local community, whereas if you send it 100 miles, every economic benefit is lost. And thirdly, smaller companies are known across every sector to be the innovators. So if we're looking for, and this is shown by this range of cuts, it's the smaller people who are offering the innovation. The supermarkets are offering a source to charge you a lot of money for that you can slap on just an ordinary piece of meat. If we look at the locations of these smaller plants, and here we're looking at an arbitrary figure of 5,000 livestock units per year, which we think is probably about the level at which we'll offer private kill on a regular basis. Private kill is, as Richard said, is where a farmer can take his animals, I'm sure you all know this, to be slaughtered and possibly packed and processed as well. So that's the locations, and you can see there's some really big gaps. Most of Scotland, a big swathe of southern England from the Isle of Wight up through to Cambridge, West Wales, all sorts of places are missing any local abattoirs. If you then compare that to the density of UK breeding cattle, you'll see that again, places like Scotland have one of the highest densities and yet one of the areas with the fewest smaller abattoirs. So there's a disconnect between where the animals are and where these smaller processing plants are. Why are they declining? Lots of reasons. The whole industry is based on low profitability. Even the biggest ones, the report last year showed that somewhere around 35% of the plants were non-profitable. And this is being pushed down by the supermarkets, and so it goes right the way down to the smaller plants which don't have the economies of scale. The burden of regulation. If you're running a small meat plant, I ran a red meat cutting room, a cutting plant, you are everything, you wear all the hats. So when you've got 7 people inspecting one aspect of your work, which we had at one point, it all falls on you, and that's just another burden. The nature, though, is not pleasant. You don't get people, young lads, going out and saying, I want to be working in a slaughterhouse. It just doesn't happen. And the decline, which Phil showed us, of the decline in meat sales is another battle that has to be fought by these people. And finally, it's very often that the value of the site is worth far more than they could ever extract from the business. Have we reached the point of no return? Of course, we won't know until we get there, but by which time it'll be too late, which is why we're really jumping up and down now to say, let's try and do something. This was a quote which Richard actually touched on earlier on from a Scottish farmer, which came out of the work I'm doing with Phil on these heritage sheep project. And he's basically saying that if they sell to Morrison's, it's 32 miles. If they want to do private kills, it's 150 miles. And so they say, we're no longer able to market our meat direct to the consumer as it's not feasible financially. If only there were local slaughterhouses closer, we have a ready and willing market for our produce. Another comment that their small abattoir teeters on the brink of closure, and the closest then would be 60 miles away. Somebody else said the demise and closure of local slaughterhouses is a major issue. What can be done? Well, we're calling on the government to announce their support for the provision of local slaughtering facilities for all the reasons I've given, and that this should be a practical thing which is spread amongst all government levels. Look at business rates for small abattoirs. That's another burden they have to deal with. Perhaps something could be done about that. Road haulage costs. Again, Richard mentioned this. The vast distances from Scotland to Wales is rather silly. And maybe there's some way of increasing the cost to them, which makes local slaughtering more viable. And to look at the use of the red meat slaughterhouse on the farm, which is going to be talked about by Paddy in much more depth in a moment. We're calling for the establishment of a task force which will urgently investigate the whole business of local slaughterhouses and private kills. They'll identify why the small abattoirs continue to close, even though there is obvious demand and pent-up demand for them. Where are the black spots? We saw a few ideas of that on that map earlier on. How can this all be remedied? What is the answer? How can we save them? And to make recommendations to government on ways we can secure the sector's future. I'll go through this because I think I'm probably running over time, but basically they look at reducing the burden of regulation, they could look at the regulation for small-scale on-farm poultry processors, which is less onerous than for red meat. Low throughput stamp. We used to have two stamps, a square one and an oval one, and the square one was domestic UK only. Nobody producing local meat is going to export, so why not bring that back with a less onerous regime for regulation? And whether veterinary inspection costs could be reduced by using technology, which DEFRA are very keen on, using live stream CCTV footage, and I'm sure Paddy will talk about that in a bit more depth in a moment. Also, we have an ongoing EU regulation problem which possibly won't continue, which is the definition of a vet. There are different vets in Europe which are called public health vets, not animal vets. Is it fair that the Merthyr Tydfil plant got a vast grant and yet the Isle of Skye couldn't and therefore failed to start? All these data that you've seen has actually been quite difficult to get because there are something like 6 different organisations collecting data, and we're calling for that all to be brought together so it's much easier to see this picture of what's going on. Maybe they don't want the picture to be seen, I don't know, I wouldn't like to say. And also whether a parliamentary committee should look into the issue of acquisitions, vertical integration and mergers, which is exacerbating the problem by making the larger plants even bigger. So, do the alternatives to the supermarket meat have a future? I think it's in our hands is the answer to that. Thank you.
One of the founding partners of a land management company called Perdix Partnerships, based in the North Cotswolds, but has clients across the UK. And we've been working with Paddy and others, Simon as well, looking at this issue for the last 6 to 9 months. And Paddy will now talk about the simplified mobile abattoir concept.
Thanks, Richard. As introduced, I'm Paddy. I'm here really to start the campaign, the mission to create and design an on-farm slaughter system. This system obviously got to be fully compliant with regulations. It has to be economically viable, obviously, otherwise it will fail, as we've already seen in the 90s. We believe that the system should be a farmer cooperative ownership structure, operating in independent hubs around the country where the demand is. Our mission started basically with 2 main reasons. One was animal welfare, the main one, and second is to allow farmers to produce high quality produce and sell it into the local market and keep in control of that whole system. And we believe that the on-farm slaughter mobile abattoir system will allow us to do that. Richard, I think, explained through a bit of the history, because obviously this isn't a new concept, but it has been hit hard by regulations, and I think the main issue in the 90s was obviously regulations over infrastructure costs and running costs. We think life is changing, and in the world today there is a vast number of on-farm slaughter systems, mobile abattoirs all over the world. You see them in America, Australia, Africa, Middle East, France, Sweden, Finland, and I'm in conversation at the moment with a guy in New Zealand who's waiting for his system to be licensed by the ministry. And actually his system is very similar to what our concept is. And by the way, I don't tend to know the answers to everything or have the solution yet, but we're on a mission and we would welcome any thoughts, advice, help and experience as we go. So this is very much a concept idea, it's not a definitive design. So our concept is to have 2 trailers, and as Richard touched on earlier, you wouldn't have a third. We think we don't need a third because the regulations are somewhat softer. We don't need the human welfare side. We're more worried about animal welfare. So our concept is to have 2 trailers, a primary trailer which would be the slaughter trailer. I call it the dirty trailer, but I'm not sure that's the right word when you're dealing with meat hygiene. So we'll keep calling it the primary trailer, which is where the slaughter happens. Clean out, skinning, it would have the ability to take all the waste and the offal. This then can, once you've got the clean carcass, send it over into the processing trailer. And the processing trailer can either just be a chiller unit which can be taken back to the farmer's own chiller, or a processing unit, or a butcher. So the two trailers do give you the flexibility of what we can do. The dirty trailer, or the slaughter trailer, would take all the waste, as I say, and the offal. These trailers would be pulled by tractors, so the hub would have to start off with a 15-mile radius hub. One day, as part of a campaign, we should campaign to get the waste material from abattoirs or mobile abattoirs, so that we could compost it, collect the methane, charge the battery with an electric tractor, which would be pretty significant if we could do that and pull the trailers with electric tractors. Having two trailers gives us the flexibility. Basically, if you are a farmer who has a chilling unit or a processing unit, we can turn up with just a slaughter trailer and carry out all that work, take away the waste materials, leave the offal or whatever needs to be done. Or if you're a farmer without any of the infrastructure in place, obviously we can use both the trailers, and we could either take the carcass back to your butcher or take it back to a central processing unit, which could be stored and then processed at a later date. It would be operated by two staff. One would be the trained slaughterman, and one the licensed meat inspector. The vet inspection, obviously, which has already been touched on, is a major part of this whole process, but using modern technology, we believe that with live broadband feed, that the inspection process ante and post-mortem can be done by CCTV. This is obviously a major part of the campaign to get that right. If there was an issue with an animal, you'd have to call in a local vet to check that it's still suitable for slaughter. But looking at the statistics, this is a very rare occurrence that ever an animal is not suitable for slaughter. One of the key points also would be to get the meat inspector to be also the OVS inspector as well. That would be fairly significant. On-farm requirements for this system at the moment, we believe it's just a simple concrete pad with safe handling facilities for livestock and water and electricity. Part of the campaign would be to introduce a new stamp, so that it would be an individual, a particular stamp for any carcass which has gone through this system, which we believe would then hopefully create a premium for that product in the future. We've started the process by, from Fir Farm, this is our 50-mile radius, you can just see the circle. The 9 blogs are basically the first 9 people I approached to say, what do you think about this idea? They are positively engaged in the concept. I haven't gone to anybody else yet, just because it's keep things simple, but there are many other people in this radius who are interested and would be interested. And out of interest, on a 30-mile radius, and from the DEFRA statistics, there are 222,000 cattle in that circle and 865,000 sheep within the 30-mile circle. We are proposing, and we have started a business plan, and at the moment we are looking at killing 3 days a week and processing 2 days a week, working 46 weeks of the year, which basically equates to killing 6 cattle a week and 75 sheep. We're basing our charges on 4 separate independent abattoir charges, so we've averaged them out. It's based on 2 staff members plus administration staff, 1 part-time member. The major costs of the system, other than the waste removal, and of course if we can keep the waste through being on-farm waste rather than industrial waste, that would be a significant saving. And apart from labour is obviously the veterinary inspection. So the CCTV system would be a significant saving. And in fact, between the waste and the CCTV system, we think that 30% of the annual expenditure could be saved on the mobile system, which is very significant. So our next steps, really, where we are on our campaign, we have spoken to DEFRA, and in conversation with DEFRA, who have been supportive in both helping with regulations and funding. They're talking about offering a 40% funding for each hub we create. We are in conversation with the FSA, and I have spoken with Alex Galanzis, I think his name is, field leader of the FSA, and Heather Hancock, who's the chairman, who are fully supportive. And what we need to do next is complete our business plan, come up with our concept design, hand it to them so they can look at it and start critically analysing it in order to help us fulfil the regulations. And lastly, we have also gone to a trailer manufacturer who is due to give us indicative costs by the end of January so that we can start putting some real figures together. So we're started the journey. There's a long way to go, and as I say, support and help is welcomed. Experience, we're all in the same boat. I don't think any of us are experts, so any help as well is welcome. Thank you.
So who'd like to make any comments on what they've heard so far?
The definition of veterinarian is absolutely fundamental in the transfer of European directives into UK law. And off the back of that, the skills and expertise of the more traditional environmental health officers in local authority employment should be a resource which should be reverted to. You've made the point that one of the major costs in this process is veterinary inspection. It always used to be cold inspection of offals by environmental health officers. The very clear distinction has been made about these vast industrial abattoirs where there is no linkage between offals and the specific animal. Of course, in a lower throughput abattoir, there is absolute linkage. And I think the fact of the matter is there is virtually no disease which is a threat to human health which cannot be identified in cold inspection of the offals. So as long as you have those offals directly related to the carcass, they can be inspected the following morning if necessary, and the carcass can be stamped. Well, there are environmental health officers operating in all local authorities, and that is a resource which should be tapped into. But it just means breaking this fixation Whitehall had with the concept of veterinarian, which was basically a complete misinterpretation of the European word in the first place. The second point I would make is be extremely cautious about reverting to a two-tier stamp. The oval stamp, which currently is sufficient for export anywhere around the world, is different from what used to be the square stamp. My assertion would be is there is absolutely no difference in the health status of that meat, and therefore we should not walk ourselves into a position where we imply that we're producing meat locally which somehow isn't fit to be sent to any human being anywhere in the world. So I think that would be a little bit of a Whitehall trap where they think we've got to do two tiers. Rubbish. We're growing healthy meat which is either healthy or it isn't, and the stamping should be done by local experts who are absolutely experts in animal health, and that is a very cost-effective use of resources.
One of the issues that we've been looking at is whether that stamp could actually suggest that the meat is superior in the sense that we're guaranteeing that it's not being transported across the country. So it's a big discussion. We don't, unless anyone wants to comment on it, we don't have that discussion just today.
We used to send cattle and pigs to the local abattoir, absolutely fine, economics meant that he was driven out. We now have a 120-mile round trip for the animals to take. But I think the answer to the question that came from over there on miles is, look, to DEFRA, you tell us what the miles are. You've got the evidence there of the maps of where the cattle are grown and where the abattoirs are. You've got the size of the turnover in Wales, and just say it is hundreds of miles. You tell us what it is, because Mr. Gove, and I believe every word he tells me, Mr. Gove is saying that he is concerned about live animal slaughter across to where we used to be part of Europe. If that is a question mark for him now, why is it not a question mark to move cattle or sheep from Scotland to Wales? It's just as far. So on that basis, come on, DEFRA, you prove to us, here is our solution of 0 miles. See if you can beat that in animal welfare. The calculation is sort of almost there. It's up to them to dig the hole as to how bad it is now.